Hi everyone and welcome back to ThursDev. I am Luke, and today is going to be another one of those game design 101 type videos. I spent some time talking about establishing design pillars for unifying a game's design, and I told my cautionary tale about feature creep. So today I'd like to talk about a more focused concept in actual design of a game, the main flow that defines a game's pacing and ideally drives player engagement. Today I'd like to talk to you about feedback loops. As you may have guessed due to the name, a feedback loop is a cycle of gameplay that feeds itself, each step of it compelling the player to move to the next step, which ultimately returns full cycle to the first step before cycling through over and over again to the end of the game in many cases. Not unlike design pillars, the feedback loop is a set of defined mechanics that are meant to work together in concert to achieve a goal. While the pillar's ultimate goal is to shape the overall design of the game, the feedback loop is a little bit more specialized, instead shaping the way the player continues through the game. The most popular example of the feedback loop is the kill, loot, buy cycle. The player kills an enemy, whatever it happens to be, using a piece of equipment. Once that enemy dies, it drops some form of loot. The loot is then used to buy new and better equipment, which can then be used to kill enemies more efficiently, which will then lead to the accumulation of more loot, and therefore better equipment, and so on and so forth. Often part of these loops are further repeated within themselves. In this case, often the player will need to repeat the kill-loot cycle until enough loot has been accumulated to buy the next tier of equipment. But ultimately, regardless of how many smaller loops exist within a larger loop, the cycle remains static. You do one thing, so you can do something else that will eventually and circuitously make doing that first thing better. The kill, loot, buy cycle manifests itself in many other successful mechanics that don't necessarily center around a game's combat, though that's a very common and easy to identify version of it. The wildly popular survival builder genre also implements a similar gather-expend cycle that relies on the conversion of world elements such as trees or sections of ground into a currency that can then be converted through crafting into tools and other objects that ultimately facilitate more gathering and crafting. Despite most of these loops being fairly transparent, they do an amazing job at keeping a player engaged and can be seen all throughout popular game design. Conventional wisdom states that though habit forming, repetition is usually considered tedious. We can easily get burnt out in the work, collect a paycheck, spend money to enjoy oneself cycle of our daily life, but in the case of the daily grind of the human condition, play doesn't typically enhance work, unless work involves play, which it usually doesn't. Our play recharges us enough to work again without losing our marbles, but no matter how hard we play, work is still work. Even a game that goes out of its way to portray everyday humanity like The Sims contains some very powerful positive feedback loops. The Sim goes to work to gain money, which it uses to buy things that improve or maintains its stats in increasingly valuable ways, which in turn causes the Sim to advance in its job. If you could get a promotion after a week at the office just by talking to yourself in the mirror for a few hours a day and making sure you're in a good mood when you get to work, I imagine anybody would enjoy the work part as well. And that's just it. What really makes the feedback loop in a game compelling is that not only does each step of the cycle facilitate the next, but they improve the next step in a meaningful way, making the next step even more compelling than it was before. This is what's known as progression, but progression is a topic all of its own. The short version is, however, that by staying within the feedback loop, the player is constantly receiving rewards in the form of each part of the loop improving in some manner. The monsters get more challenging, the loot drops become better, and the gear becomes more epic. Some games are feedback loops in and unto themselves. Take the wildly successful Angry Birds. Love it or hate it, despite the extreme simplicity of the game is made up of a very tight, well-defined feedback loop of completing puzzles to unlock new levels, which over time unlocks new birds that are usable to play in more challenging levels. This content is presented at enough of a pace and with enough variance that it remains fresh for the player over the long haul. Because of its nature, the feedback loop is a repetitive process. Though a many-step feedback loop with multiple sub-loops can exist, at the end of the day the feedback loop necessitates that the player repeats the game's core mechanics over and over in accordance with the loop. With enough variability and depth, the loop can remain engaging over hundreds, even thousands of repetitions. But a failed feedback loop, one where the feedback breaks down or reward pacing is wrong, leads to a sort of feedback loop byproduct, most commonly colloquially known as grind. If you're an avid player of role-playing games, especially JRPGs, you've likely encountered a grind at least once. This is a genre where the kill loot buy loop is one of the most central mechanics most frequently, and also, having worked on JRPGs over the course of my career, I can with confidence say that it is also among one of the hardest to balance without eventually running into grind. Most commonly, grind in an RPG occurs when items on offer in the buy phase of the loop are too expensive or not desirable in the face of a more compelling carrot on a stick that's dangled in front of them too early. In either case, the player becomes stuck doubling back to the kill phase ad nauseum because the loot they receive isn't enough to push them into the buy phase. When encountered with grind, the greatest risk to a game is that the players will churn, which is to say they'll stop playing the game out of frustration or waning interest. If not in the kill loot buy cycle, often and perhaps even more painful, the player will be caught grinding character levels because they feel that they're underpowered and unable to defeat the enemies that they're facing. Regardless of the form it takes, grinding is an example of a feedback loop that's gone bad. It's on the designer to tune the game to the point where each step in the loop transitions smoothly into the next when the player follows the loop correctly. It's fine perhaps if a player progresses too quickly and has to slow down because they hit a spot where they've come unprepared, but encountering grind or even running out of content too quickly can be the death knell for a game. When designing your game, establishing a strong core feedback loop is a key factor in building player enjoyment. If done improperly, though, it can do just as much harm as it has potential to do good, so be mindful when building those feedback loops. Remember, though, that each part of the loop should feed and enhance the others, and that the player should always be traveling through the loop, and ideally never, or at least rarely, hitting friction in the form of grind. And that's it for me for today. I hope that you found this video informative, if not interesting, and that you'll drop by again soon. I really appreciate each and every one of you that comes around, and I'll be back again tomorrow, and really any other given day. But until then, take care.